for coming to the Singularity Summit. This is Singularity Saturday. And look, just to keep it brief, we hope you really enjoy your time here. There's today and tomorrow, and we're supposed to start at 9, we're running a little bit late. It'll be ending at 9 PM today, and there'll be breaks soon. Okay.
Okay, so thanks, Adam. I'm Rob Sparrow. Thanks Adam for the invitation, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And thanks also for his excellent work in organising this event. I need to start with three apologies. First, I'm a little bit sick, so if I sound a bit husky and croaky, or my voice starts to give out, I've got some kind of a bug at the moment. I also have recently become a parent, so we've got a newborn daughter at home, which means that I'm not sleeping a great deal. So I'm probably slightly less coherent today than I might have been a couple of months ago. I'm also a somewhat odd speaker at this event because I don't really believe in a singularity. I don't think Moore's law is a law. I think that the social impact of technological change from 1890 to 1910 was greater than the impact of technological change from 1990 to 2010. If you think about what happened to societies across those periods, actually the internal combustion engine, some kind of civil works engineering had a greater social impact than the IT revolution. So you might well wonder what I'm doing talking. I guess the other thing I should say is I see no evidence that people really understand the nature of mind. I'm a philosopher at Monash University. I see a lot of very bright people coming through giving lectures on philosophy of mind. Nobody really knows what it is that we're trying to imitate, let alone has a genuine idea about how to do it. I mean, it just seems to me wildly speculative to be thinking about what will happen if we managed to generate artificial minds. I'm also curious about why people spend so much time thinking about the kind of threat of artificial intelligences and the threat from nanotechnology, and not so much time thinking about the threat of genetically modified leprechauns. Okay, the possibility that little green men might overrun the Earth. Actually, that seems to me equally likely. We have people could, and notice that magic word "could," which occurs so much when people talk about technology ethics. Something could happen, therefore we'd better treat it as though it would happen. People could genetically modify people to make them very small, green and malevolent, but you don't see huge literature responding to that threat. Yet I read endless articles about the threat from grey goo. Nobody's got a clue about either of those really. You kind of got to wonder about that. So it seems to me that what's really going on here is that the kind of healthy revolutionary instincts of IT workers for radical social change have been sublimated into this kind of techno-fantasy. Really, we want the world to change because it's pretty crap. There's all sorts of things that need to change. We're finding it hard to imagine radical social change, so maybe the AIs will sort it all out for us. Maybe the singularity will sort it all out for us. That's my kind of take on the social forces producing concerns about a singularity. What am I doing here? Well, it does seem to me that technology matters. It does seem to me that new technologies do raise profound ethical challenges. And so I work in that area. I work on both the ethics of AI and ethics of robotics, but also on the ethics of biotechnology, which is what I'm going to be talking to today. Now, I'm pleased that people are here discussing those issues. So I'm pleased to have the opportunity to talk to people who are concerned enough about the future to be thinking about kind of the challenges posed by new technologies. I personally think it's the biotechnologies that raise the more profound philosophical and political issues. Now, I gather that the title of my talk I know that the title of my talk caused some controversy. And I kind of regret that. What has happened here is a kind of misunderstanding of the relationship between two literatures. In the field in which I work, the ethics of genetics, or one of the fields in which I work, this title is not at all confronting or it's maybe slightly provocative, but people will know immediately what I'm referring to. And to use the word eugenics in the context of a debate about genetic technologies is no longer taboo. So to establish that, let me show you a few of the works that I'm responding to. And when I've done, I'm actually not a huge fan of PowerPoint either. I haven't got much of a PowerPoint presentation, but I did want to show you some book covers and some article titles. So, oops, wrong machine. Let's try that one. Okay, this is a book about which I've been writing for the last couple of years. This is John Harris, Professor of Law, I think, or Philosophy at the University of Manchester. Very influential in this field. This book has been much discussed, and I've been writing about it for a couple of years now. Enhancing Evolution, the ethical case for making better people. And this is a book that argues that we are morally obligated to use new genetic technologies to make future human beings better. Now, can you see that and not worry about eugenics? I'm not quite sure. When we look at the covers of these books, I know John Harris is not a fascist, okay? But that image is a pretty fascistic image, isn't it? Superman's arm against a rising sun. You've got to wonder. Okay, this is Human Enhancement by Julian Savulescu and Nick Bostrom, both major figures in the literature on transhumanism. Julian Savulescu is a colleague of mine at Monash University. He did his PhD at Monash University. He's recently been appointed to a visiting professorship at Monash University. It's kind of striking. None of these people are especially well built, by the way. And it's kind of striking that when it comes to what our enhanced future will look like, again, this is not a particularly surprising image. Here's the reason why I used eugenics in the title of my talk. This is Nicholas Ogre. Nick's a friend of mine. We studied together at the Australian National University. This is his book, Liberal Eugenics in Defence of Human Enhancement. And again, look at that manly chest, marching forwards into the future. Now, I guess what I'm concerned about is whether or not this is non-coincidental, that the program of what's called liberal eugenics, or the new eugenics, which is the idea that we should be using genetic technologies to improve human beings in a non-coercive, non-state-centric, pluralistic fashion, can actually be distinguished from the old eugenics, or at least that the distance is as far as people think. And I don't think it's a surprise that when it comes to this project, these nice philosophers writing good arguments about how, of course, we all want our children to be better. Wouldn't it be lovely if little Johnny was stronger, smarter, more long-lived? It's not surprising that when you put that into the public sphere, and when you follow the arguments where they lead, you actually end up with these quite disturbing authoritarian tendencies. Okay, here's a couple of article titles. Again, these are all papers about which I'm writing or have written. Savulescu, one of the most cited papers in the bioethical literature. Why we should select the best children. Again, Julian argues not just that we've got a right to choose better children using genetic technology, but that we're morally obligated to. If you don't have the best baby you can, you're doing the wrong thing. You're a bad person, a bad parent. Again, Savulescu and a couple of his students, again, some of whom I know, why eugenic selection is preferable to enhancement. So I'm not the person who introduced the word eugenics into this literature. This is just the field in which I'm working. Again, new breeds of humans, that is not a phrase to be used lightly. the moral obligation to enhance. Now these things, these are very influential papers in the medical ethics literature. So what I want to do now, for whatever time I have remaining to me, is actually talk a little bit about whether we can distinguish both philosophically and politically the distinction between what's called the new eugenics and the old eugenics. The old eugenics, people think that they know what that means. Actually, the history of the eugenic movement is much more complex than people realise. It wasn't just the Nazis, there was the eugenics movement in Melbourne, there was a very famous and influential eugenics movement in the United States. The Swedes, of all people, the lovely social democratic Swedes, were actually sterilising people on eugenic grounds until 1970. So it's not just the fascists who were concerned to improve the race through state-centric use of genetic technologies. Now, people who want to say, look, I'm for genetic enhancement of human beings, I'm for genetic selection of human beings, but I'm not a Nazi, okay, which I take it as most people in this area, will say, look, that's the bad old eugenics. The new eugenics, one of the things that was wrong with the old eugenics was that the science was really terrible. In particular, a failure to adequately distinguish between the social reasons why people flourish or die, and the genetic reasons why organisms flourish and die. The new eugenics, so the old genetic science is supposedly bad, the new genetic science is supposedly good. Now, one thing to recognise here is that all of our existing science is undoubtedly wrong. Okay, I mean, that's the nature of scientific progress. So when you look back and you say, you know, oh, those people in the 1930s, they had such bad genetics, you've got to shudder when you think about what people will say about us. You've also got to recognise that it's really hard to talk about genetics in a way that's intellectually rigorous. So I noticed in Gregory Benford's talk, someone who's working essentially on the technology of human enhancement, obviously a very smart man, still made a claim, wasn't explicit, but the reason why a young man fell off a bridge the other day was because of his genes. You know, that he had been his genes were not being passed on because he was obviously unfit. Now, if you actually know anything about that case, the reasons for that were nothing to do with his genes and actually a lot to do with a very dysfunctional background, a lot of social dislocation. So still today, we need to be very careful to distinguish between social forces and the forces of natural selection. Forces of natural selection typically operating over much longer periods than social forces. So things like when people start investigating a gene for criminality, you've got to recognise that it's easy to turn people into criminals. You just criminalise something that they do. Okay? And in fact, you can eliminate criminality by legalising a lot of things. So the thought that there could be genetics behind whether or not you're a criminal because you smoke marijuana, there might well be genetics behind your desire for marijuana, but there's not going to be a gene for criminality in relation to marijuana because that's a social issue. So again, this stuff has to be dealt with.
How about this, just honesty?
Sorry?
How about those who are born dishonest?
Look, I'm not sure that anyone is born dishonest. I don't know. Infants are not capable of honesty or dishonesty. I'm not going to deny that there are genes that have play some influence in behaviour. That's clearly true. What I would want to question is whether or not it was even possible to describe dishonesty in a rigorous fashion. Whether you could even recognise a dishonest person in a way that wasn't drawing on categories from social sciences. So that what we're trying to explain is typically a social phenomenon. I mean, I do this with my class. It seems kind of instinctively right to think that there would be some genetic determinants for same-sex attractiveness. Okay.
Some dishonesty is approved, like white lies to protect.
Okay, but let's just talk about the case of homosexuality. It's actually, once you start to think about it, can you be a virgin homosexual? So, can you be a homosexual who's never desired someone of the same sex? If you've only ever slept, if you're a man, you've only ever slept with men, but you desire women, are you homosexual or heterosexual? The category actually...
Bisexual.
Well, is there any man who's never thought about it? I mean, the category of homosexual is a socially constructed category. So when scientists sit down to try to work out what the genetics are, what they're trying to explain is something that is already completely socially bounded. So we need to be, this distinction between good science and the bad science is going to be really hard to maintain. Now the other thing that the people who are into the new eugenics say is they say, look, we respect individual rights. The old eugenics was coercive, authoritarian, monolithic, state-centric. We respect people's rights. We'd never force anyone to enhance their children. We'd certainly never forcibly sterilise them. We'd certainly never herd them into death camps. And if there's going to be any kind of regulation, the future genetic technology will be market regulated rather than regulated by the state. And it's that distinction, whether or not you can actually imagine a future society where people are using genetic technologies to enhance their children without actually having a strong role in the state that is essentially making important value choices about who gets access to the technology and what they're allowed to use it for. It's at that point that I think the distinction between the new eugenics and the old eugenics breaks down. So, can we maintain this distinction both philosophically and politically? Now, the interesting thing about transhumanists writing in this literature is that they typically wish to maintain two positions, two philosophical positions that I think are essentially in serious tension. One is what's called consequentialism, which is essentially concern for human welfare. That seems quite sensible. When it comes to moral evaluation of the use of genetic technologies, we should say, what's the result for real human beings? Let's not worry about religious injunctions, let's not worry about absolute moral laws that we have to mysteriously intuit. Let's just look at human welfare. There's a lot to be said for that. On the other hand, they're typically libertarians. So Harris, Savulescu, various other people writing this literature are what's called libertarians. Essentially think that people should be maximally free to do whatever the flip they like when it comes to the use of these technologies. Again, that seems like a good thing. I have large libertarian strands in my own politics. So on the one hand, you say when it comes to the use of these technologies, let's look at the impact on human welfare. On the other hand, you say, let's make sure that the state never controls it. Let's make sure that people are not forced. Let's defend individual freedom. How lovely. Sounds good. Now, there are two different issues when it comes to human enhancement that we need to keep in mind, and there's also, I've got to make two more distinctions. The first is the difference between enhancing yourself and enhancing your children. Now, it's actually, I think it does make sense to be libertarian about self-enhancement, with certain caveats to do with positional goods and social consequences. But essentially, if you want to get your, third robotic eye happening, or you want to grow some horns on your head, why not? Okay, if that's what kind of rocks your world, or if you want to take cognitively enhancing pharmaceuticals, essentially, it makes sense to be libertarian, or it makes more sense to be libertarian in that area. But when it comes to enhancing our children, and that's mainly what's interesting in the debates about enhancement, because there's the welfare of another human being involved, we need to be much more careful. Whether or not I'm allowed to, I think it would be great if my child was essentially a hat stand. Okay, so I'm going to genetically modify my child so that they're very tall and thin and immobile. That looks profoundly morally wrong. So libertarianism starts to look a bit more problematic when you think about enhancements on our children. We also need to distinguish between two different types of enhancement. We need to distinguish between what's called person affecting, which is where you can identify an individual whose welfare is changed as a result of the enhancement. Person affecting enhancements from non-person affecting enhancements. Now that's quite a hard distinction to get your head around, so I'll do a bit to explain it. Recombinant DNA technology applied to an embryo would be a person-affecting technology, or arguably person-affecting, because you can say, my baby was rocking along, it was only going to have an IQ of 100, I found a gene in a squid that makes their brains really big, I introduced that, I did some recombinant DNA technology to genetically modify my embryo, and now my child has a huge brain. I can say if I didn't do that, my child would have had an ordinary brain. I did do it, therefore they're enhanced. You can identify the person, you can say that they're better off. That's a person-affecting technology. So lots of, giving them a whole lot of amphetamines when they're young, educating them, giving them lots of breast milk turns out to be a powerful technology of human enhancement. These are person-affecting technologies. But actually, it's hard to imagine a person-affecting technology more powerful than education and breastfeeding at the moment. We simply don't understand enough about human biology. It's going to be really hard to show that it's safe. So when it comes to your identifiable child, you're going to be very brave if you start genetically modifying them. That's going to be a big call. There's another thing that you could do, is you could choose your embryos. So if say Greg Benford's, examines his flies, his Methuselah flies, finds some genes associated with not having cancer, with longevity, and then you use a technology called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to look at your embryos. So instead of having kids the old way, you go down to the IVF laboratory, the woman has to extract her eggs. It would be really good if we could make more eggs. If you're into this kind of thing, the egg extraction process is painful and slightly dangerous, and you only get a small number of eggs. There's various technologies around at the moment that look as though they might radically multiply the chance to produce eggs from using stem cell technology to create gametes from the woman's skin cells, for instance. But essentially we want a lot of embryos, as many embryos as you and your partner can make. And then you put them all through a genetic screening process and you identify their genes. And you say, this one has better genes. This one has the best genes of all the embryos that I've created, that we've created. And then you implant that, you might chop that embryo up to make sure that you've got multiple copies, perform embryo splitting. You implant that in the woman's womb and you give birth to a child who has the genes better than the other children that you might have had. Now this is a technology that people are using already, not to enhance so much as but to screen out things like cystic fibrosis, anything that you can identify a gene for, particularly if it's a single gene disorder with strong penetrance, then you can screen out those embryos. But of course, if you're born with no disease genes, no genes that predispose you to cancer or heart disease, you will be enhanced. You will have extra longevity. And certainly if we can find genes associated with IQ or longevity, we could use this technology, if you're prepared to have kids in this very technologically mediated fashion, to ensure that your child is born better than well, is a phrase that someone uses in this literature. Now what's interesting about this is that if you do it, your child can't thank you for it. Or in fact, or more interestingly, if you don't do it, your child can't curse you. Okay, so Harris and Savulescu think you're morally obligated to do this. But you imagine being born what we currently consider normal, the third child in a family with, you know, the first two children were screened and selected, and they have all these wonderful genes, okay, and so they're flourishing as a result of those wonderful genes. You don't. You're ordinary. And you want to curse your parents. You want to say, Mum, Dad, you bastards, why aren't I better? And you suddenly think to yourself, well, hang on, had they chosen another embryo, I wouldn't have existed. So you can't say, I would have been better off. What you can say, somebody else would have been better off in my place. And it looks as though you can't claim to have been harmed. Equally well, you can't claim to have been benefited. So these technologies are what's called non-person affecting. They don't harm or benefit any identifiable individual. And that makes the obligation that Harris and Savulescu identify quite tricky. Because on the one hand, we do have reasons to have the best child possible. If you knew that one child had a gene for cancer and another child didn't, but one embryo, sorry, had a gene for cancer and another child didn't, why wouldn't you choose the child with no genes contributing to disease conditions? On the other hand, if you don't do it, it doesn't look as though you've harmed anyone. So that's a really tricky proposition. So it looks as though we have reasons, or indeed, so why we should select the best children, Savulescu says. But if we don't do it, it looks as though we don't harm anyone. Now, can we then say, look, people should be free to do this, but not genuinely morally obligated to do this? Imagine that you could have a child that would have a life expectancy of 200 and an IQ of 200. And you choose instead to toss a coin. You know, so you're doing IVF for other reason. The PGD, the pre-implantation genetic diagnosis technicians come back to you and say, oh, you're so lucky. Look, we think this embryo, if you implanted it, that child would be born with life expectancy of 200 and an IQ of 200. And you say, oh, we don't really care. We think this is a bit unnatural. Toss a coin. In that situation, who thinks you'd be doing the wrong thing? Who thinks you'd be doing it if you knew that of these two embryos in the petri dish, you're going to have a child. You know that one of them will have a double the life expectancy, double the IQ. Who thinks that you have a, let's start with, who thinks you have a strong reason to choose the better embryo? Who thinks you do the wrong thing if you don't? Okay, so some people, that's the tension that I think is interesting here. Now, at the very least, if you think that people have a strong reason, you've got a reason to educate parents. So one of the weird things about, Julian does indeed travel around the world advocating having better babies. He says parents should have better babies. He says it's okay if they don't, but they should. Already we're part of the way to a eugenics society. We should reinvigorate the Better Babies program. We should have a government education campaign. Make sure you choose the best child. We're not going to lock you up or murder you if you don't, but we strongly encourage you to look at the benefits that genetic technologies can offer you in relation to your children. Now, is it true that there are no harms associated with not choosing the best child? Let's think about social costs for the moment. Think about how we already are starting to feel when parents have a child with a preventable genetic disorder that they could have screened out. Should your taxes go to pay for medical bills for a child that somebody else did not avoid having when they could? Your tax bills will go up as a result of other people's failure to enhance. So actually we do have a reason to think that existing people are harmed by the reproductive choices of others. So maybe we should actually be putting tax incentives to having better babies. Maybe we should be saying, look, if you refuse this genetic testing, You need to take out extra health insurance. You need to pay for the complete costs of your children. Now, of course, the moment you do that, you've got a very strong, effectively coercive pressure on people to have better children. You end up, you have the traditional market choice. Look, you can have an ordinary unenhanced child if you like. It'll just cost you twice as much. In the same way, you can choose not to have a mobile phone. Does anyone here not have a mobile phone? You've got one person. What does that say about the extent to which the choice to carry a mobile is free? No one's forcing you to do it. There's no law that requires you to have a mobile phone. But surprise, surprise, we've all made the same choice. And there are significant disadvantages now of not having one. The public phones are disappearing, you miss the business contracts, your friends get annoyed with you. So the whole set of subtle coercive pressures working to ensure that we all make the same technological choices. So essentially, I think a future in which people have access to this technology is also a future in which they will be effectively required to use it. Now, maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe a world in which everyone is more, is healthier, more intelligent, longer lived, maybe that's something we should embrace. Even if a nice social democratic government is strongly encouraging you and giving you tax incentives to do that. But I do think that the distinction between the old and the new eugenics is starting to break down there. I'll say one more thing about that. One of the things that's interesting about this notion of the best child is that there'll only be one. There's only one best child out there. If you really think that people are morally obligated to have the best child, the child that they should have is probably a cloned offspring of Arnold Schwarzenegger and Beyonce. Okay, well, I mean, that's actually fairly unlikely, but what we need to do is we need to find the person out there with the best genome. Clone them, and then everybody have that child. That'll be the best child. Your child is deficient in all sorts of ways. Your genes are not the best. You'd be very lucky to have the best genes. There's only one person who has the best genes.
Sure, there's diversity to circumstances.
Okay, no, this is true. And indeed, what I haven't also... Think about the impact that skin colour has upon life prospects. Okay, and this is another thing that you should be thinking about in the context of these debates. Being born with dark skin, with lots of melatonin in Australia, is actually a kind of natural advantage because you get less skin cancer. But it's arguably still a social disadvantage. So when it comes to having the best child, if you're really worried about your child's life prospects, and you know that by liking their skin, they could avoid a whole lot of racism, aren't you morally obligated to do that as well? Certainly if you're a mixed race couple in the US today, and you could use PGD to select skin colour, and you just looked at things like expected life expectancy, income for African Americans and white Americans, and you said, we want our child to have the best life, it'd be really hard to explain why you shouldn't be selecting their skin colour. But of course that's completely contextual. So yes, in China, you should have a child that would suit Chinese ideals of health and American, but there'll still only be one in each of those. So I think that's problematic. I haven't suggested a solution, but I don't think this is a technology that we can embrace lightly, unless we want to end up all having children who are going to look remarkably the same and have remarkably the same set of capacities. I'll open for questions there.
In the workforce.
Okay, now it's true, look, this is a large topic. It's actually most of my academic research, so I could talk for hours and hours and hours. I've probably already spoken for too long, I've tried to cut it short. It's true that you might think, I made an argument, I don't think I've got the citation here. One of the interesting things when listening to Greg Benford's talk is he was concerned that you should have, essentially, we should be able to have the longest possible life expectancy. We already have a powerful technology of human enhancement when it comes to our child's life expectancy, which is sex selection. Okay, if you want to have the best child possible, the best child possible is actually a girl. Now, I published this in the American Journal of Bioethics recently. If you blind people to the reasons for the impacts on life expectancy, it turns out women live kind of 3 to 5 years longer most places around the world. It just looks like maleness is a disease condition. Now, that gets terrible. People get terribly upset about this, and I don't have time to have the whole argument now. But one of the obvious things to say is if we all had girls, that might be bad, you know, there might be negative social consequences of that. So, what's interesting there is the only way around that is to prevent people from having access to their technology. It's to say, look, we don't want everybody coming out the same, so we're going to insist that you don't use this technology beyond certain limits. Because if you did, you'd all choose the best child, and the best child is actually fairly determinate. And that might have negative social consequences. The moment you start to look at the social consequences of people's use of this technology, and you start to regulate on that basis, which I think we have to, you put the state back at the centre of the new eugenics. You've essentially said, look, you're free to use this technology, but you're not all allowed to have the best child. Some of you will have to have suboptimal children for the sake of diversity. And that's going to be a hard argument to win. So yes, you can make an argument for diversity, but the only way to get parents to choose diverse children will be to actually prohibit access to this technology. Now, there was a question on the back, but with Rebecca.
I was just going to say, isn't the choice of what the best child would be contextual not just to a culture or a nation, but to each set of parents?
Okay, so the short answer is no. It's highly unlikely. Look, if Sevalescu said why we should select whatever the child we like, you haven't got should anymore. Okay, the notion of the best child implies that some children are better than others. And actually there is a fairly obvious sense in which that, I mean, if I said here's a pill, it'll allow you to live 5 years longer. Who wants, I'm handing them out up front. Take this one pill, you'll get an extra 3 to 5 years of life in reasonable health. Who's coming down the front for that pill? Show of hands. Okay, because it's better to live longer. Girls are better than boys. They live 3 to 5 years longer. Now, of course, there's all sorts of other things that you can say. But while it's a difficult argument, if you say there's no such thing as best, best is a completely subjective notion, then you don't have an argument for human enhancement. The notion of enhancement requires that we can agree that there are some things that are better than other things. So, parents should have the best child is quite a different claim to parents should have the child that they want. Okay, I'll go here, and then here, and then here. Yep.
Well, isn't there a good chance that the forces that make this, you think that people will try to access these technologies before until them is a good chance that happens?
Look, there's a really interesting thing that goes on in arguments about technology, is that when it comes to technology, everyone becomes an anarchist. Okay, they say we can't possibly regulate, or it's impossible to regulate. But actually, if I tried to win an argument about whether we should prevent spousal murder by saying, look, you can't stop people going to Bali and murdering their partner. Okay, nobody would say, oh, you're right, we should get rid of those laws off the books. Okay, so no one would conclude that we shouldn't at least regulate or try to regulate from the fact that in some cases you can't stop people doing things. So, yes, I think that this technology will be regulated and should be regulated. Whether that it will be possible to have truly effective global regulation, that's a much harder question. I actually think the level of public concern about this technology is so high that the moment that we learn that Bill Gates has spent $25 million having a genetically enhanced child, there'll be a tremendous public outcry and it'll be regulated. But I think what's more interesting is the way that there's a kind of creep with access to this technology. I mean, we've just been, my partner is also a bioethicist. You know, we've just been through the process of having a child, and if someone says, here's a test, it'll reduce the risks to your child, it's really hard to refuse. Okay, so I think it's actually the creeping sort of nature of this technology. People will say, look, if you have PGD, you can ensure that your child doesn't have a gene for breast cancer, doesn't have a gene for heart disease. So genes that predispose for these things. Then I think actually it'll just be taken up as a part of normal public health. And one of the things that's interesting is it's really hard to say where the distinction between screening out disease conditions and screening in human enhancement begins. I mean, again, I take it that that was something that Benford was right about. If you get rid of all the genes that predispose you to dying, you'll end up very long-lived. But that just looks like a kind of enhancement, selection for longevity. Here in the middle, yep.
I think it's almost inevitable that in 2-3 generations we will be doing some sort of choosing on our children simply because it is available. Now my problem is not what we do it, but that's inevitable for the maximum 20% of the world's population which has the ability to do so. Are we in some ways creating this permanent underclass of third world countries? And what will happen when they realize they never can catch up with us?
The short answer is yes. I think that we will create the permanent underclass, but the problem with that argument is that we already have. The seriously wealthy, they already live on a different planet. Okay, you're born in California to millionaire parents, or you're born in the Sudan to farmers, you might as well be on a different planet. You might as well actually be in a different species.
You have the choice, the possibility.
Well, I guess the other... You could do everything that you liked to have an enhanced baby, and then you get wiped out by a bus on the way home from the hospital. Okay, genetics isn't destiny. It's juggling the risks. So, the problem, I have some sympathy with that argument, but the social consequences of inequity in access of these technologies, the problem is that by analogy, all our medical technology, almost every medical technology that's routine for us is not available to the very poor elsewhere. And it's quite a strong argument that says we shouldn't have this, we shouldn't use this until everybody has it. Now, I mean, I guess it's possible that the son or daughter of farmers in the Sudan could become a dot-com billionaire, but it's pretty bloody unlikely. So I'm not convinced that the distinction between sort of genes which kind of where there's no contingency and education where it's possible that people will rise above their circumstances, I don't think that can do enough work. Does that make sense? But look, certainly some American philosophers have written about what they call species splitting. Okay, the possibility that we'll essentially just end up with the genetically enhanced who are so sort of different that they have nothing to do with ordinary people. And I do think there's some danger of that. Actually, to be frank, I think we will all face civilizational collapse by global warming before any of this becomes genuinely problematic. But if we could escape that, then yes, we would need to seriously regulate this stuff to avoid species splitting. Gentleman here.
Rob, perhaps too early for thanks, but I'd like to congratulate you on bringing to us a penetrating socio and logical analysis on reproduction. And my next sub-question is, could we have your presentation today somewhere available on the web?
Look, I believe the video version probably will be if I don't think that I've said anything too wrong. You can actually, these papers here make most of the argument that I've made today. And there's actually there's a version. This presentation is based on a paper forthcoming in the Hastings Center report, which is an American bioethics journal, that will be out with a bit of luck later this year. Okay.
You've got time for one more.
All right.
Lev.
Okay.
I think that a lot of what you've discussed today and the way that's been presented, correct me if I'm wrong, you've drawn quite heavily upon Habermas's work on the future of human nature. The problem I had when I read that book several years ago, 2003, is all of us are born never asked.
Yeah, okay.
Every single one of us. I didn't. So why is there like some additional moral responsibility that is apparently being paid on to parents for deciding to have a child that doesn't have a genetic enhancement? When somebody could turn around and say, "Well, damn it, you parents sort of went out and gave birth to me, and I'm in a developing country, and that sucks."
Yes, think of how much I could have risen above my circumstances if I were more oppressed. Look, I think actually, I don't think that I was making the Habermas argument.
Okay.
There's more arguments that I would make if I had time, but I'm essentially interested in the social consequences. I just think that people are naive to think that we can allow access to this tech, simultaneously say, this is a technology that allows you to have better children, you're morally obligated to have better children, well, no, that we won't end up either explicitly or effectively requiring them to have better children. That's it's whether there's a liberal eugenics possible that's my main target here. And my argument has essentially just been, look at the tensions between the claims. Yes, you should be free, but if you've seriously got a reason to do it, it turns out that we have reasons to encourage you to do it, maybe even to require you to do it. Now, the Habermas claim, Jürgen Habermas made this claim that essentially there's something wrong with you having a designer. Okay, in the future, you will be born the product of your parents' explicit genetic choices. I'm Microsoft Baby 2.6. You bastards. What a Linux baby. Open source baby. And you could say, I don't like feeling that I'm the product of somebody else's desires. And the point Lev's making quite correctly is that we're all shaped by parental choices. I actually think there is some room to rescue Habermas's argument because there's a difference between having a designer and just being constrained by your parents' choices. We're all constrained by our parents' genes. Nobody is born with radical freedom, with no constraints. But we're not all born with a Nike swoosh on us. In the future, if someone find a gene for it, we might. Clearly my voice is giving out because my parents did not make the correct genetic choices. I might leave it there and hope to talk to some of you later over the rest of the weekend. Thanks.